welcome back to my channel. I'm so excited to be doing this video today. We have a special guest. I've honestly followed your psychology videos, I think for a while. So I was like
Wow.
stunned when you emailed me. Now we're chatting about writing, and I had absolutely no idea that you were a fiction author. There were a ton of questions that I wanted to ask you about your writing journey and how you kind of found your way to fiction. But first, I wanted to give you a chance to introduce yourself for anyone who maybe hasn't met you yet.
I'm Ana Yudin from the channel Psychology with Dr. Ana, but I also just opened a different channel called Book and Hearth that's more about books rather than psychology. So I'm a doctor of clinical psychology and also an author. I write, like kris, speculative fiction, so thrillers with speculative elements, horror, fantasy, things like that.
You know, with your background in psychology, I think a lot of your expertise could be, or sort of like the intersection of your background and the fact that you're a writer, I think will be very interesting for a lot of people who are also in the writing community. What drew you to psychology specifically, and also what was your journey to getting your doctorate?
So it's funny, when I was little, I always wanted to be a writer. And then when I got to undergrad, I mostly just wanted to learn more about people. So I dabbled in cultural anthropology, sociology, psychology. I did also take creative writing workshops, as many as they would let me take before they said, like, stop, like, we have to save this for
So,
people who are majoring in it.
yeah.
um, and I picked psychology just because it seemed like the most interesting out of the humanities that I was looking at and more
Mm,
stable than, say, creative writing.
yeah.
Um, but my passion for writing definitely never stopped. And then I went on to grad school to get my doctorate in clinical psychology. And I feel like the two really go hand in hand. Like, what I love about writing is often what I love about psychology too, like getting to sort of highlight the threads in people's lives. Like, you do get a little bit of
Mm,
that in particularly like psychodynamic therapy, and you also get to do that when writing like patterns and themes in novels.
mm.
Sort of stepping into someone's mind and imagining how they see the world definitely helps for both. So I feel like a lot of why I went into psychology is also why I wanted to become a writer, ironically.
How did you get into writing? I know that you mentioned you got into it as a kid, but do you have any like formative experience, like one memory where you're like you consciously thought to yourself, like, yes, I want to be a writer?
I can't remember like the moment that I realized it, but I do remember growing up a lot. I would spend the summers back home in Romania, and I didn't know anyone except my family. Like, I didn't have friends
Hmm.
there. And so sometimes we would go to my grandpa's house, which didn't even have like plumbing, let alone Wi-Fi, until I was like 10 years old. So I would
Okay.
just be like with a blank piece of paper, just like writing the summer away, just like to keep myself
Yeah.
occupied. And it was great fun. So like I look back on that fondly and just thinking like, yep, this is for me.
Oh, I love that. I used to do that too as a kid, actually. I would
Oh, really?
like write stories on literally lime pieces of paper. That's so, yeah, that's really cool. I also like to ask all writers like their favorite books or even just like any favorite media that they feel like this story really informs my own writing. It's like a very formative piece of writing for me.
I really like Elizabeth Kostova. She wrote The Historian, which is like kind of dark academia with like a little bit of Dracula in there.
Oh,
It's like
yeah.
600 pages long and very purple, but I love it
Oh
so
my gosh.
much.
Is it an
Um,
old book?
no, I think it's like maybe 10, 15 years
Oh, okay.
max. Recently, I've been obsessed with Maggie O'Farrell.
Yeah.
I read, what's it called? Not Hamnet. I have that one on my bookshelf, but it's about Lucrezia de Medici. I'm blanking
Oh,
on the name. I don't know why. I
yeah.
can't stop talking about it. Now I'm blanking on it.
Oh,
But
nice,
her
nice.
writing I find so very beautiful. Also, Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia.
Hmm.
Um, it was very cool to see somebody sort of weaving Jungian psychology into something of like Gothic horror, because
Yeah.
those two are elements that I am also pretty drawn towards.
Yeah.
Those are the ones that come to mind at the top of my head.
Well, for those of you who don't know, I read Anna's query letter. She let me critique it. And
Thank you.
I was like, oh no, it was my pleasure. Like I offered, I was just like, wow. Especially when I was reading your synopsis, I was just like, oh my gosh. Like it just like felt very vivid as a premise. And I remember thinking to myself, like, I wish I had the pages. So yeah, I hope your query finds a home very, very soon. How has your journey with querying been? I know you're also a self-published author, but you're also kind of dipping your toes into traditional. So if you want to talk a little bit about like what drew you to self-publish and then also how your querying journey has been.
So, yes, I am currently self-published and hoping to get traditionally published. The reason for that is that although I love the independence of like doing everything yourself or self-publishing,
Yeah.
you gotta constantly be marketing yourself and it can be pretty exhausting. And I know
Yeah,
it's
for
important to
sure.
still market yourself when you're traditionally published too, but it would be nice to have like the resources of an institution like helping keep
Hmm.
the momentum.
Yeah.
Um, and especially because my type of fiction is a little bit more seasonal, like people enjoy horror and witchy books more like towards autumn.
Mm,
Um, I feel like I wasn't as invested in that throughout the winter, and now that we're in like
mm.
summer, I'm like, okay, I'm ready to go. I have all this energy and inspiration. Because for me, like
Yeah.
summer solstice is pre-autumn. Like we're in
Yeah,
pre-autumn
yeah,
now.
yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I'm currently querying for actually two novels, so we'll see which one gets an agent first.
Mhm.
Um, knock on wood.
Yeah.
And it's just heart wrenching. It's terrible.
Yeah. It's like the longest months of your life, I remember.
Yeah, and I understand why it takes so long. I understand like you're basically cold calling and people are
Hmm.
reading your stuff out of the goodness of their heart, but it really does feel like it can go on for so long that like you have no choice but just like keep moving on to the next one, on to the next one.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's definitely I think the most healthy mindset to have is like I wrote it, I'm querying it, and I just like do my best to not forget about it, but to not like tie yourself to it, I guess.
Yeah,
For
for me the hard part is like figuring out when it's ready to be queried because like I
mm,
don't want to be too hasty, but also like I'm really excited, but it
yeah.
would be really silly to submit like a first or second draft like without like
Yeah.
really examining it closely. But it can be hard to
Yeah.
not because it's so exciting.
Yeah, you kind of just want to like dip your toes in. I guess in terms of your writing process, what is your typical writing process from, getting the idea to deciding I'm gonna query this and it's ready to query?
At first, I marinate like we were talking about just earlier. I
Yeah.
let different themes and like mystical elements kind of intrigue me and I just let them build for a little bit without manipulating them much. And then when I feel like I have enough to string them into a cluster, I might do a little bit of brainstorming, like thinking about, okay, what themes do I want in this? What kinds of characters? What setting? What time period? And if I feel like it's enough to work with, then I might start thinking about a very rudimentary outline. Um,
Hmm.
I'm not huge on outlining, but I will usually have like an idea of at least what I want the main points to be. And then once I get closer to each chapter, maybe like what the next three chapters look like. And then usually I start off by writing. That's when I find that my mind is sort of clearest, sharpest. So after I do my like journaling and coffee, I'll start writing. And I write for about like 3 to 4 hours. And that's usually when I need to take a break because otherwise it's like kind of digging myself into a trench if I don't feel
Yeah.
motivated to anymore.
Yeah.
But sometimes if I'm like near the end of a really exciting piece, I'll push myself and burn myself out because I can't help it.
Yeah. Those are the best moments though, when you're just like, I'm so locked into the scene.
Yeah, I find that especially for like really tragic twists, I get so irrationally excited. I'm like, ah, I just got to kill off this
Me
character.
too. Yeah, I
Oh,
think
I'm
it's
glad it's not
funny.
just me.
Yeah, for me, I feel like writing the first few chapters, I'm like, boom, I can just do it. Like chapters 1 to 3 happened very fast for me. Then the rest of Act 1 to like the midpoint is like the slowest part for me because I feel
Hmm.
so far away from the end, but I'm also like detached from like the excitement of the beginning.
Yeah, that's why they call it the messy middle, right? Like I
Yeah,
don't think it's fun for anyone like when it's not like new and exciting anymore. I mean, it's still exciting, but it's not new
it's not
and you're
new.
still so far from the finish line.
When you get to the end of your first draft, what is your process like? Do you let it sit and then reread it, or do you kind of have a critique partner or beta readers?
Yeah, I sit for at least like a week or two. It's just happened that the last couple of novels that I've written so far, um, they just coincided with like a vacation. So that was perfect. I was just
Mm,
like, okay, I'm gonna go on vacation and not even gonna look at it at all. And then I
yeah,
usually give it to my husband and he'll be like the first person to read it, catch all the silly mistakes I made.
yeah,
Um, then I modify it, and then I'll give it to critique partners, beta readers, sometimes editors. I'm still like on the fence about whether to get a professional editor for the one I'm currently just finished.
yeah,
Um, and then it's just like round after round of knowing when to stop and like I feel like time really is the best way to
yeah,
look at it with a fresh set of eyes, which is frustrating because I don't have a lot of patience when I want to get a
yeah,
project out, but
yeah,
I guess that's the perks of all these roadblocks in the publishing industry.
yeah. It's it's tough, but yeah, I know like for me, I always tell myself like let me just not read it for 5 days, and then literally the next day I'm like my eyes are fresh, I can read it now.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I'm terrible with that. One thing that I want to ask you, and I know you already touched upon this when you answered the first question, but how do you feel that your psychology background informs what you write?
I would hope that it helps me get a better understanding of like my character's psychologies. It's hard to say because I don't know what it would be like if I didn't have a background in psychology, so I don't know.
Mm, yeah,
Maybe it would be the same, or maybe psychology does bring something a little extra to it. I really can't say. Um, at the very least, I do like to write about depictions of mental illness and personality disorders. And so that
hmm
I feel is helpful because I feel like I've grasped that pretty well in my training. And now I'm
hmm
able to make it more realistic in the way it shows
yeah,
up with the characters.
yeah. What I'm very curious if off the top of your head, um, if you can name like what are the best and worst depictions of mental health that you've seen in fiction, whether it's books or movies. Like, is there any story that you feel like this is such a good representation of what it feels like to live with this, and also just like very harmful depictions?
I was actually just thinking about like depictions of mental illness in books, and I feel like I haven't read that many. The one that comes
Mm,
to mind is The Last House on Needless Street. Have you read that one?
I have not.
It's really good. I would recommend it. I don't know if I should say what the disorder is because it's a complete spoiler.
Oh, okay.
But I really liked that one because it didn't demonize the person with the mental illness.
Yeah.
Uh, and I was reading the Goodreads reviews on that book because I have a horrible habit of like rage reading Goodreads
Me
reviews,
too.
even for books I love.
Yeah.
And some people were saying like, "Oh, I'm so tired of mental illness being used as a plot twist," and I was like, "Well,
Mm,
I think it was done responsibly. I think it humanized the character, and
hmm
so I don't understand why certain topics or mental illnesses have to be off limits in fiction if they're done
Mm,
responsibly.
yeah, that's true. Is there any like piece of media that you felt like is like a terrible depiction of mental health where you were like, ugh, why did they write it like that?
Probably, I'm sure in movies there have been some. I can't think of any at the top of my head, but I feel like movies are a little bit less cautious with being sensitive around that just because it's more of like
Mm,
action, like
yeah.
less diving into the person's psychology and more just shock value.
Would you say you have any advice for any writers who are like writing about mental health in their works, like if they are writing characters who are living with certain illnesses, like what would you recommend to writers who want to write those things responsibly?
I think it's good advice to write what you know, not necessarily in the sense of like a mental illness that you have, but something that you're
Mm,
very well versed in, whether it be somebody in your close circle has it or you have some sort of education in it, because otherwise
mm,
it can be easy to fall into stereotypes.
yeah.
Um, Even so, like, I think there's some value in stereotypes because sometimes they're true of a person's experience, but if
Hmm.
you don't have any lived experience with that disorder, then it is just a stereotype. Like, it's not based on an
Yeah.
actual experience that
Yeah.
someone happened to be a little bit stereotypical.
Yeah.
So
That's
just
true.
do your research, and I guess I would ask you what's the intention behind it? Is it just for shock value, or is it because you genuinely want to understand this person and sort of portray their inner workings responsibly?
I think this is like it almost reminds me of how, especially in movies and TV shows, body disfigurement is like often associated with villains. And in the same way, I think there's still a lot of like negative associations with certain types of mental illnesses being like, this is what leads this person to be violent, um, things like that.
Which is such a simplistic way of viewing it. Like if you
Hmm.
really go into what makes that character tick, then you should be able to explain like what exactly about their mental illness caused them in conjunction with other things to act a certain way rather than just like mental
Right.
illness A causes bad behavior B.
Yeah, like it's a much more holistic experience, I guess. And a lot of times I think for a lot of people, um, having a mental illness doesn't necessarily just spawn from like one singular event. It can also be like multiple things throughout their life. In terms of what you're currently writing, if you want to just like chat about it a little bit, um, if you want to speak on like what you're currently querying, the two books that you're currently querying, and if you're writing anything right now.
My debut novel that I self-published, The Curse in Their Veins, is kind of like I guess witchlit, like a grounded fantasy, not high fantasy, but like real world with some fantastical elements.
Mm,
Currently, I'm querying two books. One of them is pretty classic gothic horror, dual POV. One of them takes place in the Victorian era, and the other POV takes place in modern times. And it has to do with the Russian legend of Rusalki, basically like water spirits that are not always so kind. And then the second book that I'm currently querying is a psychological thriller with speculative elements. And this one's kind of about the friction between science and spirituality, and the characters trying to figure out if these strange occurrences happening to her are supernatural or if there's a scientific explanation behind them. And
mm,
that one's definitely kind of got me out of my element because it's very grounded in some ways,
yeah.
in some way that I'm not used to. I'm used to a little bit more like magical elements, and even though it like hints at them, it's very much like modern times, lots of
Mm.
dialogue. So although I like the book, I wouldn't say I feel as passionately towards it as just like full on gothic horror. That's really
Right.
what I hope to come back to. And I'm also
Yeah.
realizing I really love historical fiction a lot more. Like when I have dual
Mm.
POVs and one of them's historical, that one is just so much more interesting to me. So I think moving forward, I'll try to do something fantastical and historical fully.
I'm curious if like you feel like there's any genres or any types of stories that are like you really love reading or watching or something, but you wouldn't necessarily write it yourself.
That's a good question. I used to be a lot more into romance when I was younger, and
Yeah.
now I feel like I don't. I would keep being drawn towards like some sort of mystical element. I would want to sprinkle
Yeah.
some in there. I don't know if I could stop myself.
One thing that you had asked me, and I also want to ask you, was when you are dealing with rejections while querying, slash, when you do get burned out with writing, what do you do to recharge? Because it's a question that I get a lot. Is just like, how do you kind of like balance your life out and also not get burned out when you're pursuing, especially traditional publishing?
Well, I don't do a very good job of it. I feel like
Yeah.
I'm a pretty naturally compulsive person, so my instinct is to just like, okay, now we're gonna send 7 query letters today, even though it's 5:30
Yeah.
already.
Yeah.
So I feel like I have to constantly like reel myself back. Like every day, it's a battle of like wanting to overdo it and needing to reel it in.
Yeah.
Uh, I would say like making weekends off limits is a good rule of thumb for me. Um,
Mm.
Simply because like I can do it during the work week because I'm self-employed.
Yeah.
Just like having those work-life boundaries is helpful. Um, and just noticing early on when I start to get burnt out, because I know that after the burnout stage comes like emotional collapse. So I definitely need
Yeah.
to stop earlier rather than later.
Yeah. I guess my last question for you is what drew you to starting a YouTube channel about psychology specifically?
That's a good question. No one's ever asked me about psychology specifically before. I guess it was because I was in grad school and it was what I was learning a lot about. So I felt like that was what I had to offer in terms of knowledge.
Yeah.
And everyone has a psyche, everyone has like psychology, so to speak. So it seemed pretty
Yeah.
universal that people would want to learn about. And I think it is a pretty trending topic, particularly because we all have minds and psychological complexes. And
Hmm.
I'm really glad I did start it when I did, because I think my life would look completely different if I hadn't. And I remember when I
Right.
was trying to decide, I was asking like my husband was my boyfriend at the time. I was asking my cousin, and their encouragement really helped me take the leap. And I just keep thinking about like if I didn't have their encouragement, where
Hmm.
would I be right now? I wouldn't even be moving to Europe. I wouldn't be self-employed. I wouldn't be my own
Yeah.
boss. Like my life would look so different.
Yeah. Do you know, like, before you had started your YouTube or before, your channel kind of blew up, like, did you have an idea for sort of an area that you potentially would have wanted to work in if it weren't for YouTube?
I was still figuring it out, but I really wanted to do couples therapy.
Oh, nice.
And yeah, I actually haven't talked about this publicly yet, but I actually decided to close my practice last December and focus on writing.
Oh, nice.
Um, so, pretty huge change. I decided to kind of
Yeah, what a
switch careers from
leap. Wow.
therapist to writer.
Yeah.
I guess cat's out of the bag now.
Wow, were you like, how did you feel about doing that? Was it a difficult decision to make, or were you like, I was thinking about it for a while?
It was difficult in the sense that not everyone in my life was happy with it. And because I
Mm.
had invested a lot in that career,
Hmm.
but it just felt like the authentic choice. Like I was studying for my licensure exam and I got to the
Yeah.
chapter where we were learning about like career assessment and career counseling. And I was
Yeah.
like, just out of curiosity, let me go take these assessments. And every single one of them said, you should be in a creative job like writing. And
Yeah. You're like,
I
oh.
remember walking over to my journal. Yeah. And I just like poured out what I had been stifling for so long that I was feeling, which was that writing has always been what I've wanted to do. I decided to close my practice. I let my supervisor know. And since then, I've been honestly very happy. And I think that's the biggest thing that makes me confident in my choices, that I don't have any regret about it.
Wow, I wish you the best of luck. I mean,
Thank
publishing
you.
is like I hate to like give platitudes about publishing, but I really do think that it's really just about spite. Like I think that is like the moments where you think like it's never going to work out for me, when you choose to keep going in spite of it and you kind of use rejections as like fuel, it's like maybe I'm like a little bit too optimistic, but I think anyone can can do it. It's just like, especially if you know it's your dream and everything.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in growth mindsets and just continuing failure after failure. So
Yeah.
I will be continuing until I get it.
Yeah, I'm hopeful for you. So thank you
Yeah,
so much
thank you.
for coming and chatting today. I will have all of Anna's links in the description box. That's it for today. Thank you guys so much for watching.
Thank you for having me.